What does Little Nightmares hide from the player behind the scenes and out of bounds throughout the entire game? In this dark adventure, we must avoid threat after threat in what feels like a hopeless attempt at escaping a terrifying water-based vessel. But behind the scenes, there's a lot going on to make this scary game work. So today, we're going to be breaking down everything in the game to show you all the tricks the developers use to make this iconic, grim adventure. We'll be breaking the game too, so that should be fun. But without further ado, let's jump right into an alternative look at Little Nightmares. I hope you enjoy. As always, I like to do a very quick recap so that everyone remembers the game as much as possible. So being a puzzle adventure game, we play as a little girl named Six. We must escape the Maw, which is a gigantic underwater vessel, full of monstrous-like characters, whom we'll be taking a closer look at. With Six being small and frail though, as a player, we're unable to defend ourselves, being potentially vulnerable to some very gruesome deaths. However, the player is able to run, jump, push, and climb various obstacles. Now with that said, Little Nightmares starts off with a dream Six is having. We awake from it and traverse through various rooms in our effort to escape. Rooms with tragic scenes, as you can see. We make friends with gnomes along the way, and of course we have our hands full with the janitor in this section of the game, which involves some hide and seek skills and a little bit of wit. But without further delay, let's jump in. So in the main menu, we can toggle our view to allow for better visibility and to break away from the traditional camera. This lets us take a closer look at the background, where we can see Six not creating the fire, but manipulating it. If we zoom out, we can see that there's not much more to the vessel. But as we start up a new game, we're greeted with this brief cutscene involving the lady. The scene shows the lady with her back to us in a distant haze. She eventually turns around slowly, looking at the player. This is the moment where Six abruptly wakes up from this dream. We then gain control of Six and can begin our adventure. But if we toggle our view once again, we'll see just how close the transition between the dream and waking up was. Going to the left of our starting point, we can find the area where the cutscene took place. The lady can be found hunched over in this swirling smoke, as her movement is in an endless loop. I will say it was pretty neat to be this close to the lady without the fear of having the life sucked out of me. If I'm being honest though, she's still terrifying. Moving forward though, we come across a room that has some chairs hanging from the ceiling. As we make our way through this room, we can see in the back that some entity walks past the door in the background, instilling the fear that the door just may open. Most players will know that the door never opens, but if we take a look behind this door to see the individual that's lurking back here, it looks like a mummy potato. No legs and no arms. I definitely had a good laugh when seeing this. Who'd have known that it was just a levitating potato that menacingly stares at the player? Although, it's probably fair to speculate that this potato is actually meant to be the janitor, whom we will be encountering through this section of the game. In the next room is a very chilling scene. It's mostly an empty room where we can see a pair of legs and feet hanging above a chair. Like I said, chilling. We normally can't look up high enough to see this individual's face, but if we break that barrier, we can see that this hanging man has no head. Obviously, this makes sense given the fact that we can never actually see this. As we progress though, Six enters a longer room where there is a refrigerator towards the end of it. Normally, when we open the fridge, it causes a gnome to come running out from behind it, exiting off screen. While I was exploring off camera, I noticed a gnome standing on a platform off in the distance. From what I can see, as soon as I open the fridge, this gnome on the platform teleports. So there are technically two separate gnomes. This technique, with having the gnomes on these platforms, is used quite frequently throughout the game, as it is less taxing to spawn all your assets in when the map loads versus making something appear. But as we carry on and say goodbye to our gnome friend, we encounter another gnome that sort of baits us into a trap. Six breaks through the floor and finds herself surrounded by both living and dead leeches. So I wanted to see if we could bypass breaking through the floor and possibly progressing forward. But unfortunately, we are met with a dead end. As we navigate further into the Maw though, we get our first glimpse of the janitor. Normally, we enter this area and the camera moves outward, allowing us to look up and see him. He appears to be dragging a cage as he crosses this bridge. If we go in for a closer look, you can see the cage is empty. Perhaps this is foreshadowing that the cage is for Six. But as he leaves the player's normal view, we can see that he just continues walking, and then disappears shortly after. At least he has reached his final form, which is no longer a potato. Fun fact though, there is collision up here, and we are able to walk around. The eye that normally kills you instantly upon spotting you has no effect up here, which makes sense seeing as we're not meant to be up here. Just a little further ahead though, I make my way into a room where we need to shut off the power to progress. There's a rat in this room that we end up scaring away. I figured I would try to see where this rat ended up going, like if it possibly went off on this off-screen journey or just simply disappeared. But I never found the rat, and in the midst of looking, I discovered a cabinet that was way down below us, floating in the void. It's right below the playroom in which we need to rush through, as the power that we just shut off is about to turn back on. It could be a leftover asset that was used in the above room, not sure. Moving on, we get to this bedroom that has multiple children sleeping in it. Looking closer at the children shows that the ones up close do have faces, whereas the other ones have bags over their heads. Peeking in these bags reveals that they're in fact faceless, as there's nothing within. When we proceed forward though, the janitor shows up, and an intense sequence takes place, as we have to sneak around the janitor for safety. If we take a look behind the door as we enter the room, he simply appears right behind the door. But instead of sneaking through the room, I decided to go through the door he came from. I had a bit of fun teasing the janitor by alerting him of my presence behind the door. The janitor appears confused as he knows I'm not supposed to be back here. He did eventually set off on his usual path, but then surprised me as he attempted to clip through the door to get me. It gave me a mini jump scare and definitely caught me off guard. Immediately after this room is where 6 begins to display some intense hunger pains. We then encounter a boy that's sitting in a cafeteria all by himself. He sees that 6 is hungry and generously throws her some bread. In my first playthrough of this game, I really wanted to try to help this boy, given his kindness and sad appearance. But this time, I'm able to gain access to the cafeteria that he's in. As you can see though, the boy continues to be miserable, regardless of our presence. But this whole room has collision, which allows us to walk around in it. I was hoping the door in here possibly had something interesting behind it, but to no surprise, it did not. Unfortunately though, we need to move on and leave this poor soul behind. We encounter similar instances where gnomes can be found out on these platforms as they wait to be activated by the player. But it isn't until the end of the section that we run into the janitor once again. It's during this part that 6, yet again, starts to experience hunger pains. As we go down to this room, we can see a piece of meat laying inside of this cage. So of course, we go straight for the meat and chow down. If we look up during this, it's hard to see, but we can see Dark 6. Dark 6 appears briefly whenever 6 feeds. I definitely didn't catch this in my first playthrough, but that's when the janitor's long, lanky arms come out from the shadows and locks us in. Remember that cage that we saw him dragging across the bridge? Well, here it is. Anyways, what we don't see is that prior to him catching us, you see just his arms alone, hidden out of bounds. So as you may have guessed, when the player falls for this trap, we can see these pair of arms activate as they come down to lock us in. I almost feel this is creepier than if it were his full body. Regardless though, it makes for a funny sight. It's at this time that we awake in a cage while we helplessly watch the janitor drag another victim away. Off screen, they just simply disappear, but it's this next area that I found to be interesting. So this next encounter with the janitor involves us sneaking by him as he continuously wraps up children and places them on these hooks that take them off screen. It's definitely an anxiety-inducing situation, but let's take a closer look at the work he's doing. We can see that once he places a child on the table, they begin to slide towards the back of it. Eventually, they clip through the wall and go further back out of bounds. I noticed that the child out of bounds goes into a fetal position as the janitor begins to lift the wrapped body to the hook. It's only until the janitor reaches into the cage for another child that we see the one out of bounds disappear and reappear in the hand of the janitor yet again. So essentially he's wrapping up the same kid over and over and over. Talk about the roll of a lifetime. But after escaping the janitor once again, we make our way through a series of events, make a friend, and then find ourselves in this room filled with shoes. For as simple as this part is, it still gives me just as much anxiety as any other creature in this game. In this room, we must evade a creature lurking under the shoes. It's pretty terrifying as this explosion of shoes chases you down. Unfortunately, even with taking a closer look, we can see that there is nothing under the shoes. But I thought it was pretty cool that we were able to see what happens to 6 when this shoe monster, as we call it, kills her. She just sort of helplessly floats in the void, left to ponder on how she got in this position to begin with. There is one other thing I noticed during this part, and it was far out of bounds from where we were. If we get a closer look, we see that it's one of the children that is floating in the void. Very far out, might I add. The weird thing with this is that I died a few times at this part and kept seeing this floating boy. But then he just disappeared after one of my deaths. I'm not sure exactly what was causing him to be there, and he just vanished. But I unfortunately could not get him to spawn again. After evading this invisible shoe monster, we're immediately pursued by the janitor yet again. He just simply never gives up. At this part, we enter a long hallway as the janitor lowers from the ceiling, initiating a chase. If we go up and out of the level, we can see the janitor waiting for us to activate him. He doesn't look too comfortable up here, which could explain why he's so angry. But we do eventually evade him in the elevator as he gets distracted with some gnomes that scatter about. After he runs out of sight, we can see him walking into the next room that hasn't fully loaded, due to the player being out of range. This brings us to the next interaction with him, and I gotta say, nothing much is going on here off screen. Although, once we evade him at this part, he walks to a door and leaves the room. Here, we can see he enters this closet-sized room and briefly contemplates on his life choices, right before disappearing. Carrying on, the next interesting section is where we are traveling through this small path and end up getting ambushed by the janitor. His hands come reaching through the walls, and you have time to escape as he's reaching for you. However, going back here with the camera shows not only one janitor, but two. It's pretty funny looking, as the arms they aren't using appear to possibly be broken. I managed to get back here and found out the hard way that those hands are very much active. Rest in peace. After this though, we have our final encounter with the janitor as he chases us into this small room. Here, we have to evade his hands and attempt to pull the cage apart that's holding the door open. After some dancing around with these hands, the player breaks the cage, chopping off the janitor's arms in the process. Unfortunately, as we do this, beyond our normal scope, the janitor simply disappears. This makes sense, of course, but one could say we still get the satisfaction of watching the janitor as we delete him from existence. But this concludes our out-of-bounds journey through Little Nightmares in the janitor area. Next up, we have the twin chef area. After escaping the janitor's grasp, we are introduced to a new set of baddies, the twin chefs and their kitchen area. So, we'll be taking a closer look at the conveyor ride in, a sausage machine that isn't doing exactly what you think it is, the chef's various kitchens, bedroom, and all the way to where we make our escape. We got some ground to cover, so let's jump in. So starting off, we find ourselves in a ventilation shaft. We just got done escaping the clutches of the janitor, but what follows is the part where we have to jump and grab onto a hook as we cross this giant space. You can see one of the chefs in the background. He eventually leaves our sight as he goes through a door. Taking a closer look, I figured the chef would disappear after going through the door, sort of like how the janitor does in the previous section, but instead, we can see that he walks in place indefinitely. I tried to get 6 up here before the chef walks away, but quickly realized both the surface the chef is standing on and the wooden platform have 0 collision. However, I was able to find collision on the other side of the doors, allowing me to walk in this area. Being in here with the chef doesn't faze the chef, which makes sense as he simply ignores us as he continues to get his workout in. Nothing else is up here from what I could tell. Although, something else I noticed is that the hooks with and without body bags are possibly being reused, as you can see them disappear and reappear. So I was wondering, what would happen to 6 if we remained on the hook while it cycles back to the front? Normally, if you hang onto the hook, a device connected to the rail shakes you off. However, if we bypass this device and hang onto the hook as it disappears, well, at first I couldn't locate 6, but eventually I saw a yellow dot in the distance. So I rushed over to it and indeed found 6, whom appears to be in great pain. Turns out that hanging onto the hook caused 6 to get permanently stuck underneath the map, as she still appears to be holding onto the hook. Her body is also being contorted, while she continuously shakes. I attempted to free her from this state without reloading the game, but was unable to do so. One could say she is stuck in a little nightmare. Sorry, I couldn't resist. Anyways, pushing forward, we can see 6 is still experiencing hunger pains. That's when we see a helpless rat that just got caught in a trap. Since she's starving to death, of course, 6 starts chowing down on the rat, and to the right, Dark 6 appears once again. I mentioned this before in the janitor area, but Dark 6 is this shadow-like entity that appears whenever 6 eats any type of meat. We can get a better look at Dark 6, as she creepily stares 6 down. This doesn't last that long, and she disappears right as we're finishing this rat sandwich. Moving on, we approach the section where we formally meet the first twin chef. As you can see, he's just as disgusting as he is in our normal view, but there really isn't much going on off-screen in this area. I did manage to have some fun with the chef though. So, if we bypass the point of activating him, he just continuously sharpens his knife. We can even get up on the table and stare at him face to face. 6 is even able to ride the knife. Well, sorta. I even tried dancing in the pot of boiling water in the background, and he never flinched. Once he's been set into motion though, I noticed that he will grab this sausage link and drop into the boiling water behind him. If we stay back and let him wander, he'll continuously do this, as he unknowingly grabs the same exact sausage link over and over again. So I make my way to the bigger part of the kitchen after bypassing the chef and acquire a sausage as a parting gift. However, to my surprise, the chef activates and, well, wait, he's not going for me. I'm not entirely sure how this happened, but I managed to make friends with the chef. I just followed him around like I was his assistant, all while preparing this feast for their guests. That we'll definitely be meeting later on in the game. Let's get back on track though. So normally the player evades the chef as we make our way up into the ceiling area and out of the kitchen. This next area is where Six must sneak into the twins' chef room and retrieve a key that she needs in order to progress. During this process, we end up encountering the other twin chef as we wake him while trying to get the key. Although, if we decide to let him sleep and take a closer look, we can see his mask is all bunched up. I went in for a closer look, only to find out that he just has a fat neck, with a tongue hanging out of it for a head. It was definitely weird looking, but also kind of expected, as the chefs are never unmasked during normal gameplay, although we can catch them occasionally lifting the mask slightly as they have an itch. If we make our way out of here with the key and down the elevator, we end up right back where we were before. That's when I noticed another gnome platform in the distance, and realized it's the gnome that we end up freeing from this jar. I had mentioned this previously, but we will commonly run to these platforms where gnomes are stored off screen. Anyways, let's move forward though and get out of this kitchen. The next area involves going into a freezer room and setting up various pieces of ham to be dropped into this sausage machine. We then go back down and use the machine to create a few sausage links and swing into the next area. Breaking off camera, we can see a platform in front of this room with leftover developer text saying, quote, "where hams get teleported upon completion," end quote. So basically what's happening here is every time a ham goes through the machine to make sausage links, the ham is teleported to this platform. Once I got all 3 hams through the machine, I got a very cruel idea and decided to take the gnome that's in this room and try putting it in the machine. I wanted to see if it would possibly teleport him to the platform where the hams go, but unfortunately that isn't the case. At least we could say the gnome wasn't harmed while attempting this. As we continue on, we run into another one of the chefs as he comes down this elevator. We can see that he just materializes in the elevator when we pull the lever, but at this part we normally hide, as we wait for an opening to flee from the area. During this, the chef shakes a crate we're hiding under and pockets some cheese. If we look at this from another angle, you can see the cheese is actually floating behind the box. We also can see that once he pockets the cheese, it immediately goes underground and reemerges, going right back to where it originally was. If we just keep sitting here, the chef will repeatedly keep taking this cheese, making it seem like he has a bottomless pocket. At this point, we're tasked with some more sneaking around, and we find that there isn't much going on off camera throughout this area. So we obtain the key, access another kitchen, outsmart the chefs, and escape this terrible place. Or so we thought. Normally, the chefs continue to aggressively chase Six down, and it's towards the end of this chase that we end up narrowly escaping, as we ride safely away on this conveyor line of hooks. So rather than doing that, I want to see if he'd still chase me while going back the way we came. The answer to this is definitely yes. When the chef is in this chasing state, he's fully determined. So much so that if we rip Six out of the level and just let her fall into the abyss, the chef, in a way, follows. The world unloads and he begins to fall as this pursuit continues. I followed them as they fell for well over 5 minutes. At one point, we can even see the chef doing a grab animation, as if he captured Six. You can see the loading icon appear as if he actually succeeded with capturing us. Another thing I tried was bypassing the other chef and continuing forward on the hook. I was thinking the same thing would happen again, like when we tried this earlier in the game. Sadly though, this kills Six and loads us back to the checkpoint. I then checked out what the other chef does after going through the door. He of course just disappears shortly after entering it. At this point though, we make it out of the chef's domain in one piece. However, I couldn't resist and decided to go back to see if they would reinitiate a chase with me after successfully evading them. As you can see, they don't have the slightest idea that I'm here, as they continue to squeal in frustration, making for a funny sight. Now it's time to move onward to the guest area and the ending of the game. We start off this section by running down this giant pipe, as we can hear seagulls in the distance. You then see in the background a bridge that leads to a very bright opening. After Six climbs this ladder, she finds herself outside this gigantic water vessel. It's quite the sight. I've always enjoyed the scenery during this portion of the game. However, there's a boat in the background that is unloading an endless amount of very large individuals. So if we stop here and take a closer look, you'll see that these guests, as they're called, are generating from within this boat. This appears to be just an endless conga line of very hungry guests. Something else to note about these big baddies is that you'll see that there are only so many of them that you'll encounter before noticing duplicates. Some wear masks, whereas others just appear to be old and homely. It is interesting to wonder what their lives are like outside the game's story. Is this just the ultimate buffet vacation? Food for thought? Anyways, panning out, you can see the water goes fairly far, making for a giant body of water. Looking behind the Maw shows a layout of our previous endeavors, but bringing 6 over to these guests does not faze them, as they continue on their merry way. No matter what I tried, they paid no mind to me. With normally not being able to come over here, their disregard makes sense. So I decided to walk down towards their ship from where they were unloading. I was surprised to see that there was collision that allowed me to walk all the way down to this ship. However, right as I made my entry, I found myself falling to my everlasting doom. After escaping this endless fall, I tried to see if I could follow the guests into the Maw. Unfortunately, due to the level unloading based on my camera angle, I was unable to explore this the way I wanted. Let's move on to the next section though. In here, we find ourselves much closer to these starving beasts. Immediately going off camera reveals the guests generating as they go up these stairs, similar to how they unloaded from the vessel. During this part, we're normally tasked with finding our way into the next area the guests are going to. The lady can be seen observing her customers as we progress. I decided to join her on this balcony and try to hide under her kimono. I traveled up through this hollow shell of a lady and found myself in her head. The view in here is, well, definitely strange. At one point I felt like I was playing as a lady as I watched my guests make their way in. Going down to the guests in person shows that they still pay no mind to our presence. I'm even able to walk into the next area with them, where we normally find ourselves jumping across light fixtures. The guests split their path in this room, where we can find them simply disappearing, shortly after leaving the view of normal gameplay. In this next room, we'll see the silhouettes of a couple guests in the background. So I took a peek back here and found lower poly versions of the guests that were floating, as they scarfed down gulps of air. It should be noted that a lot of the background feasting will be going on throughout this section of the game. Moving on though, we encounter our first aggressive guest, as he throws a table and charges at us. If you haven't guessed already, they eat you if they catch you. So I wanted to see what this looks like up close. We can see 6 does a quick movement into the guest, but then just helplessly floats within the belly of the beast. However, evading this baddie is fairly simple, and we can move on. We avoid another guest as we climb these plates and swing over her. It's pretty funny to look back at her after clearing this part, as she still tries her hardest to reach for 6. This next room doesn't really have anything going on off screen, although I put the camera on some of these guests' heads to observe their endless eating animations. It's fair to say the guests are bottomless pits with their nightmarish appetites. After narrowly evading the guests, we run by one that initiates a chase, forcing us to leap to a light fixture and swing to safety. I went to look back at this fella and found another guest behind him and was, well, you'll just have to use your imagination for this one. Looking down shows a previous room we were in before and reveals that this poor lady is still trying to reach for us. Like, just eat your food, Tina! This next room is a rather large dining hall where you can see many of the guests chowing down. Normally, you're met by this handsome fella and get chased back from where you came from. We then hop over the doofus and run for our lives as we slide to safety. But instead, I join the feast. They once again do not mind my presence. You'll notice I'm able to clip right through them. I jumped down and ran towards the back in an effort to go up these stairs. As you can see, 6 just clips right through them as well, leaving me with not much else to do back here. Moving forward, we end up getting chased by one of the chefs into a bathroom. Successfully hiding causes the chef to retreat and lock us in. I then followed him off camera only to find him stop right in front of the elevator. He'll stand there in a puzzled state until we progress, which involves breaking this mirror and climbing up and out of the bathroom. When doing this, the chef will blink into this background room. Normally, we only ever see his silhouette, but going in here shows the chef chopping, well, almost chopping what appears to be ham. Coming here with 6 feels unsettling, but luckily no danger is presented by the chef as he continues chopping away. Imagine if you were to sneak up behind him and light him on fire. I know, this thought process concerns me too. Moving on though, we go down the elevator, which takes us to the next horrifying chase sequence. 6 needs to run through this section without stopping, as guests start pouring out of the back rooms and give chase. It truly was panic-inducing when playing this part of the game for the first time. However, looking back here at the guests before they chase us makes for a funny sight. They lie all over each other as they wait for the player to activate them. While looking around, I noticed one of the guests above the map, just hanging out by herself. I wasn't sure why she was here, but once I began the chase sequence, I realized that this guest's purpose is to drop down and block any chance of going back. So moving forward, as you can see, I tried doing this chase while still off camera. I managed to navigate through it successfully and eventually made it to safety. Going back and looking at the guests after they failed is funny, as they clipped through one another and tried to form a guest centipede. Sorry. Anyways, now to my least favorite part. This is where 6 starts having hunger pains once again. We find a gnome that appears to be kindly offering some food to us. If you're not new to the game, then you'll know that 6 decides that the gnome is on the menu and not its gift, as she devours the gnome. Despite the sadness this scene brings us, Dark 6 appears to be pleased. Moving on follows with the lady who is taking the elevator. I rushed over to see if she actually goes anywhere, only to see that she simply disappears. After taking the elevator, we progress to the lady's personal quarters. At the start, there's nothing really going on off camera. Normally, 6 has to go upstairs and sneak past the lady to progress. She indefinitely stands here until you move on to the next room, as she awaits her cue, which involves us, the player, knocking this vase over. After doing this, we can see that she vanished, which is exactly what her model does if we watch off camera. Taking the key to the locked door is uneventful, along with the following chase sequence we have with the lady. It's quite the horrific chase, but again, as you can see, nothing is happening outside of what we normally would see. This next part is where we find ourselves in this large room, where we end up having a showdown with the lady. Normally, we grab this mirror from the next room over, and we come back to find the lady patiently waiting for us. She poofs into thin air, and then we're supposed to defend ourselves with this mirror as she continuously tries to grab 6. Before doing this, I went out of bounds and saw that there's more to this room than the player would realize. Above it, you can see an unloaded room with text that says, "Debug teleport to end." So I decided to bring 6 up to this room and discovered that it's the same exact room. It appears this room is used for when the lady is defeated, whereas the other room is for the entire fight sequence. Without going out of bounds, the player would never realize that this room is a duplicate for when the lady falls to 6, making it interesting on how this transition takes place. Moving forward, when the player gets near the mirror at the start, that's when the lady appears in the large room. I very quickly realized that there's no way I could defeat her with the game view I was currently using, as you cannot see the spotlight that you need to be in for safety. Taking a closer look at when she kills 6 shows how much contortion she puts 6 through. I couldn't help but notice that the lady was having a bit of a stiff neck situation herself as she destroyed 6. I did get lucky in one instance and guessed where the light was a few times, but in the end I had to change the view back. This fight doesn't really hide much from the player, but I did have fun fighting her as I used different camera angles while doing so. She nearly gets me on one of her attempts, but the light saves me right at the last second. I always enjoyed this fight sequence, which, like most of the game, keeps you on your toes. However, after fending her off a few times, we finally hit her with the almost final blow, breaking the mirror in the process. Dark 6 is of course standing by as we approach the helpless lady. Her mask was blasted off a few moments ago, and as you can see, she looks terrified. Safe to say, she didn't see this sequence of events ever happening, which includes a child draining the life out of her. So after this intense killing by 6, we are loaded into the last section, which involves 6 walking down this huge dining hall. There are guests in this room that are just eating away, but as we progress, the darkness within 6 devours every single guest as we walk by, making for a very brutal sequence. Sadly, nothing more than what we normally see takes place here. After this, a giant door opens that reveals a way outside, as you can hear seagulls in the distance. Taking the camera up here shows an abrupt end, as 6 stops walking and the credits roll. So that concludes the regular playthrough of Little Nightmares, but we're not quite done yet, as there's one more area to check out, and that's the chapter select screen. So we have the 5 sections of the game, including the 3 DLC expansions. Getting closer into the prison shows pretty much what you'd normally see. However, in the Lair, I was able to get a peek at the janitor, only to discover that the janitor's arm abruptly ends. At the end of the arm, we can find a small cube though, and what's interesting is that the material for the janitor is assigned to this cube. So you can see the janitor's textures applied uniformly to this cube, when normally these are mapped to the janitor's model itself, like the arm. The kitchen is another one that doesn't really hide anything from normal view, although getting up close and personal with the chef is still quite horrifying. The guest area has 2 pals just enjoying a meal that we normally don't have a full look at, as the other guests fight for 6. It's the ladies' quarters that I found to be the most interesting though. First off, 6 appears to be manipulating fire, as the lighter is non-existent. However, getting a closer look reveals the lady in an endless animation, where she's looking towards 6, then turns back to her left, where she eventually resets. You can see her mask is locked in place, which allows us to get what probably is the best look at her face that we've had. She appears calm here, but what she doesn't realize is that she's already dead. But that wraps up our out-of-bounds journey through Little Nightmares in the guests area and the ladies' quarters. So now that the main game is done, let's move on to the DLC in its first chapter. Before the DLC starts, let's take a peek at the Depths chapter selection area. Within, we can see the runaway kid on a cupboard as he's stranded in this flooded room. Taking a closer look doesn't reveal much else outside of what we normally see. However, if we take a look within the kid's model, we can find a cube up in his neck. This is similar to a cube we found earlier inside the Janitor, and the texture map material for this character is applied to this cube. So it's kind of neat seeing this in this form still in the game, when normally it's spread over the actual model. With that though, let's talk about the Depths. As always, I'd like to do a very quick recap that will help everyone remember the DLC and where it takes place in the story. So being a puzzle adventure game, initially we play as a little girl named 6 in the main story. We must escape the Maw, which is this gigantic water vessel, full of monstrous-like characters. But as the story unfolds with 6, another is taking place deep in the lower levels of the Maw. Hence, the name of the first section in the Secrets of the Maw DLC, the Depths. Here we play as the runaway kid, who also has a strong desire to escape this, well, little nightmare. Playing as the kid, we're unable to defend ourselves, being potentially vulnerable to some intense deaths. But with some quick and keen decision making, we shall hopefully prevail. At the start, we appear in this body of water in which we can swim around in. It doesn't last long though, as this hand rises from the murky water, grabbing the kid and viciously pulling him under. But it was just a dream, as we wake up in a familiar room. Let's go back to that dream though. We're going to brighten things up a bit and take a closer look at this area. If we take a step back, we can see the kid's dream actually takes place above the room he wakes up in. However, let's get a closer look at the owner of this creepy hand. This hand belongs to the Granny. Before starting her attack sequence, she could be found underneath this body of water. Initially, after pausing the game, I found her hand protruding through the floor of the room. This Granny looks like Gollum's long-lost soggy grandma. There's no ring to rule them all down here though. Just Granny doing some stretches before she drowns a kid. Eventually, she teleports below our character and then advances on our poor defenseless runaway kid. As he's dragged down, they both disappear, with the area unloading and the kid teleporting down to the room where we wake up. While in this camera mode, I move the camera back to get a wide shot to the entirety of this DLC's first section. And as you can see, we have quite a ways to go throughout this ship. Back in the room we woke up in, you can see children sleeping in other beds that we took a closer look at in a previous endeavor. It appears we're going to be adventuring through some areas that 6 also does in the main game. Heading out of here, we initiate a chase scene down below us involving another kid and our old friend, the Janitor. This long-armed creep will chase down the child and will corner and grab them. Then he'll walk back from where he came, eventually disappearing off screen. Before the scene begins, we can find the poor child standing by, waiting for his cue to be chased. The thing is, we can also find the same kid flailing in midair within the door the Janitor comes from. However, the Janitor instantly appears right in front of the door as the chase sequence begins. As he chases, we can see his arms get caught up by this cage, causing them to bend in unnatural directions. They do correct themselves shortly after though. When the Janitor grabs the kid that ran, we can see that the model disappears and then reappears in the monster's hand. The model we saw shaking around earlier gets instantly moved to the Janitor's hand and replaces the other one. We can see he's no longer floating over here. Normally, trying to get down here while this chase takes place is futile, as we break every bone in the kid's body. But we can nightcrawler our way down here with teleporting. While doing teleportation and having the game frozen in time, it's a bit trippy looking though. So our character's body is what gets moved, as it's the actual player controller, but the hair doesn't move until the game updates on the next frame. This is because the hair is designed to follow our player model as it's parented to it. So you get this funny model smearing before the game updates. With teleporting down here, you can see I can't interact with the boy that's running. I was hesitant to engage the Janitor at first, but I attempted to be a hero and rescue this kid. Instead, I end up getting grabbed by him with the boy disappearing in the process. Not what I expected, but here we are. In my next attempt, I wait for them to exit through this doorway with a, well, unsurprising result. He winds up and grabs me on the spot, just like before. Because the camera is currently detached, it's preventing the game from reloading after our death, which allows us to remain in this instance to explore. Moving on though, the player can't follow the janitor, so we have to go down further, where we have to avoid an eye, a form of added security for the Maw. If caught in the light, the victim turns into a statue. As we're avoiding the light, we encounter another child who runs away as soon as we get close. She scurries away with a flashlight as she goes off screen. Teleporting down to her bypasses her action to run away, and she'll remain standing there. We can't interact with her in any way though. Following her with the camera shows that she runs through this entire hall and then through a wall. She enters an unloaded room where she'll continue to run and then she eventually disappears. Going this way reveals more familiar rooms that we've previously encountered as 6, but eventually we catch up to the girl. She makes her escape through this window as we're tasked with finding a way up. By the time we make our way up and out of the window, we can see the girl is well ahead of us as she runs away. However, as she's making her way out of the window, we can find another model of her below, and this one is frozen in place. Once girl number 1 is out of normal view, she disappears, as girl number 2 remains frozen until a character goes through the window. She crawls through this hole, disappearing shortly after. Following this is where we find ourselves taking a trip down this long pipe and into some lovely murky water. From another perspective, we can see that the kid actually doesn't fall and floats right below the opening of the hole up top, and then teleports down below, making it appear as if we fell through the pipe. It's not looking too good for this kid, as the situation worsens. So as we progress, we find a way up on this ledge and then encounter some lovely leeches. They move faster while in water, but as long as your dodging is on point and you're quick about it, you can escape by climbing out of this area. Following this leads us into our next encounter with a granny as we cross this body of water. She spawns in the back left corner once we get near the middle of the room. You can see her spawn in with this different viewpoint as we cross. She looks like she's just really happy to be here in her diver's pose. Slowing it down, we can observe her gracefully swimming towards our character. We can also see that her legs aren't connected to her torso. It actually looks like her whole pelvic area is missing. This doesn't slow her down though. She's hungry. Even without modifying the game, as she grabs me, she never ends up pulling me down. It ends with my character flailing at the surface of the water as it fades to black. This happens a lot, and I'm not sure why that is. However, from here, there's quite a bit of ground that we cover that doesn't have much going on outside of normal gameplay. We clear this pipe filled with leeches and solve a puzzle that involves lowering and raising the water level in order to progress. I did find a lever above this area where we changed the water level. Sadly though, I was unable to control my character properly while off camera, as I blindly walk above here in this default camera view. Regardless, I wouldn't have been able to reach it anyways. Sad face. The next area brings us back into the danger zone with Granny. Normally, you have to jump from one object to the next as you try to avoid this soggy lady's grasp. I ended up trying to confuse the granny by teleporting the kid down under the water, where he can in fact breathe, by the way. This makes sense, as we're never meant to be down here to begin with. Joke's on me though, because she starts to sink and clip through the floor and then teleports below me, as oh, never mind, she doesn't see me. Wait a minute, I think she's caught on, and I'm dead. But because the game's camera is still dislodged, the game keeps going, resulting with, well, the granny continuing her swimming as she flails the kid around like a puppet on strings. It was pretty hilarious to see this take place. As you can see, I just let the game keep running while she continuously tortures our poor runaway kid. After respawning, I teleport to the following area where we continue our journey evading this grandma. While pulling up this bag of bodies, we can see some resistance while we are pulling, as if Granny is trying to pull it back down. Pausing it while this struggle occurs, and taking a closer look reveals she's nowhere near this bag during this struggle. But after leaping to the next area, we now have to feed Granny. With this part, feeding her allows us the time we need to swim safely out of this area. When throwing meat into the water, we can see her sink and then teleport underneath her meal. She'll take one nice bite out of it and then sorta just zones out, eventually entering back into her hunting mode. The meat vanishes when she's done and then comes back out of this pipe, as you can see, essentially reusing this meat over and over. After clearing this, I found a shoe and threw it in the water to see if Granny would interact with it. However, the shoe does not interest her as she continues to swim about. Moving on, as we climb up here and jump up to this door, it leads us into another flooded room that needs to be drained. Pulling this lever will do just that, followed by the player needing to break this jar on the table. Breaking it reveals the key we need in order to progress. Oh yeah, there's a leech in there too. Taking a peek inside shows these two are not actually in the jar prior to breaking. It's only when the jar breaks open that the leech and key spawn in. But now we can unlock this door and carry on. So we make our way to another puzzle that involves trying to get across this water without getting electrocuted. Sadly, nothing outside of normal gameplay really occurs here. So we move on, but not without nearly getting electrocuted again. Talk about cutting it close. This leads us to a creepy shower that has this eerie looking hole in the middle of it. My first time playing through this, I kept my distance from this black hole, but if you do decide to jump into this hole, it leads to death. Getting a better look at this hole though shows that it's not really that deep. However, when the player jumps in the hole, they clip through the visible ground and fall out of the room. We can see a random leech on our way down, but as you can see, because I'm in this camera mode, we continuously fall forever, eventually becoming a speck in this great abyss. Upon leaving the showers, we get a brief look at Granny, as she sinks into the water upon our arrival. If we don't enter this next section, she will remain in that same position until we enter. I'm beginning to realize how scary it would be to encounter her outside the water. She's one tall lady. While a character is on objects in the water, Granny will hit the object in an attempt to knock us off our feet. Watching this from below shows just that, as she swims up and uses her flabby muscles to hit the suitcase. End result, I die. But the fact that we never see her eat the kid convinces me that she just needs a friend. I mean, look how well they get along. Moving forward, this flooded section works similarly to the previous ones, as we continue to evade Granny. After reaching a safe spot, we once again have to solve a puzzle that involves finding a lever and correctly positioning this suitcase. The lever winds back as the door begins to shut, so if you're not quick enough, the door could easily crush you. However, after completing our task and successfully getting out of here, we find ourselves nearing the end of this first section, which will also be our last encounter with the Granny. When we enter this room, we push this door down and we can see Granny in a chair. She immediately slithers into the water upon our arrival. Taking a look at her while she's sitting in this chair is pretty funny. You'd imagine she's resting and perhaps her eyes will be closed, but no, she's just sitting here all wired up, anxiously waiting for us to show up. As she was slowly but surely entering the water, I was surprised to see that there was another Granny down there. The second Granny spawns right underneath the other as she sinks into this frozen position, while the other Granny pursues us. This other one's hand is stretched out, along with her legs and feet appearing to be twisted around a bunch. Her other hand is also deformed. At a quick glance, I thought she had a potbelly too, but it's clearly just the angle of her model that makes it appear this way. A duplicate version of the door we pushed into the water sits at the base of this room as well. This door probably gets swapped out like the other models we've been seeing. Anyways, we're yet again tasked with trying to cross this water safely. When we get to this buoy, it slowly starts to sink as if Granny is pulling it down. In a similar fashion, like the bags we were trying to pull up a little bit ago, Granny is actually not interacting with this buoy. Moving on and successfully evading Granny leads us to this final showdown with her. Once we make it to this area and climb up to this spot, we then need to pull this lever, which turns on the power. This follows with us then swinging over to this balcony, where we then pull another lever, raising the water level. Doing this upsets Granny, and she reacts by tearing the balcony down. If we wait to pull this lever and look underwater, we can find Granny with her arms stretched out, patiently waiting for a cue to strike. As I was taking a look at this, to my surprise, another Granny emerges, as she clips to the black floor. But wait, there's more! Following this sequence of events, after this balcony breaks, we need to make our way over to this other balcony that has a TV on it. While doing all of this, we can see Granny viciously trying to stop us, as she makes multiple attempts to tear down this platform. If we go back underwater and continue exploring, it's revealed that there aren't just 2 Grannies in play, but there's actually 4 Grannies. Well, 5, including this one under the floor, but it's these 2 that grab my attention. Reason being is that we can see these Grannies rocking out like there's no tomorrow, as they're throwing up the rock and roll hand signs. I guess she knows she's about to go out with a bang. So we push the TV into the water. Watching the TV electrocute Granny is kinda brutal, so I slowed down the speed of the game to get a better look. Unfortunately, I killed the kid in the process though. But clearly it's too much for Granny, who eventually explodes off the balcony pole and slowly plummets to the floor. She partially clips to the ground, making for a creepy, watery grave. Rest in peace, Grandma. Oh yeah, we're dead too. After restarting, I decided to check before I complete this area what would happen if I teleported the kid to the TV platform and pushed the TV off the edge. This will be taking place before the power is turned on, not to mention the water being raised as well. The end result is that everything occurs nearly all at once as soon as that TV hits the water. Dead Granny proceeds to be electrocuted as this Granny on the far left begins pulling down the balcony. The water is rising as all this takes place too, which probably explains why I found Granny all contorted from when she was electrocuted. It's kinda neat to see all this transpire from a sequence break. So we restart one last time and successfully complete this section to move on. This very next room is where we begin our climb, as we take these stairs followed by this long ladder. This eventually leads us into this room where we're immediately greeted by the janitor, as he reaches out with his long, dangly arms and grabs us. The screen then cuts to black. Checking this out from a different view reveals that it is in fact just his arms and hands we're being captured by. These arms will just wait for the player to enter the room and can't be dodged. But if we teleport up here, we can bypass the trigger for the janitor to grab us. This allows us to roam around this room without the fear of being grabbed. There's not much to explore in here though, as these hands are sleeping on the job. The only catch here is now we're locked in this room until we reload the last checkpoint. And with that, this concludes our Out of Bounds journey through the depths section in the Secrets of the Maw DLC. So now let's tackle the Hideaway and Residence chapters. So we just put Granny out of her misery only to be captured shortly after by the janitor, concluding the depths section. It's here where we'll load in, only to discover that we're locked up in a cage right alongside 6. The camera will pan out while the janitor grabs our cage and drags us off screen, with the screen eventually fading to black. Pausing the game and getting a different view will reveal that the janitor doesn't load in right away during this scene. Immediately becoming sidetracked, I began venturing out of bounds, finding that the previous area was still loaded in. We can see the janitor's lonesome arms just hanging out as they contemplate their life choices. With the previous section still being here, I realized that it's actually after this short cutscene that we end up loading into the next section. However, if we watch this cutscene unfold from this angle, you'll see the janitor simply loads in as he creepily reaches for the kid. Nothing surprising happens here, as the janitor will just continue to drag us onto this empty platform, with the loading screen eventually cutting us off. This follows with a scene where we can see the kid was bagged up as he makes his escape. However, before taking a closer look at that, we can now see that we've loaded into the next section, as I attempt to get a better look at the entirety of this layout. As I was coming back to where we currently are, it took a moment, but I realized that the kid could be found laying on this pile of coal. This is where we land as we break out of the bag and endure a nasty fall. This prompted me to go back up to the bag we initially came out of, and as you can see, there are, in fact, multiple models of the runaway kid during this scene. Going in for a closer look within this bag reveals an uncomfortable situation. It's the kid, all contorted within here. It's painful to look at as multiple parts of the kid's body are twisted about, including his feet, arms, and hands. His torso seems to be warped, along with the arms clipping through it as well. Watching the kid escape from this view is something like out of an alien movie. The kid bursting out of the bag as a xenomorph would from a human chest. Once he gets out, he falls as he attempts to grab onto this pipe. After losing his grip, he'll continue to fall and break through this board. It's here where we can see the other model of the kid that's on the ground slide to the back of the coal pile, as the other one continues to fall, clipping through the floor. I lost sight of him, but realized that his body ends up teleporting here, where he remains in this fixed falling position, forever lost in the void, never to be seen again. Well, at least this model of him, that is. I'm not entirely sure why the other model of the kid slid back the way he did, because normally, when the camera moves down after the fall, he is found in the center of the coal, as our little gnome friends approach him. It's visibly clear that he's out of place in this instance though. The following section involves running around with these little guys, as we have to interact with them in certain situations, like opening doors for example. We can see gnomes in the background fleeing from the kid, eventually disappearing entirely, as this other one slides into position while in a T-pose. What I found more interesting though was how these particular gnomes make their way through this door as we enter the room. Watching them squeeze through this door from this perspective is goofy looking. The body assumes its position as the head blasts through shortly after, immediately disappearing. There is another gnome that will end up getting stuck in the door, whom we have to assist and pull out. Taking a closer look while this little guy is stuck in the door reveals another gnome that is clipping through the ground. As it, I honestly don't know what it's doing, but it's funny looking. I deleted the floorboards and tried the same with the grid material underneath, but unfortunately, this crashed the game. After reloading the game though, I noticed the gnome in the ground doesn't appear until we grab the gnome stuck in the door. Furthermore, moving the camera reveals a platform labeled with text that states, "is swapped with stuck gnome," where this stuck gnome is waiting to be swapped. Deleting the door shows how the gnome moves from the platform and to the spot, but it's not until we pull the gnome out completely that the swapping of the gnome is complete. As you can see though, this little guy just continuously bounces. It sort of looks like he's tickling himself repeatedly, as his hands continuously open and close. So proceeding onward, a lot of the upcoming area doesn't have much going on off camera and behind the scenes. It involves a lot of freedom being given to these poor little gnomes we come across though. Saving the gnomes is the only way to progress, but it was here where I found an extra staircase underneath the one we actually use, which was interesting. Eventually we get to this giant furnace that will end up turning on, and the gnomes will then begin grabbing coal and throwing it into the furnace continuously. The objective here is to get more gnomes to join our cause, so we can get this contraption running. From this view we can see this bad boy is pretty big, which would explain the need for so much coal. Moving on, as we're saving these gnomes, we'll see a similar setup with this particular one that is stuck in the coal, as the energetic, bouncy model stands by out of bounds, waiting to swap with this one in the coal. Once doing that, we're then tasked with finding a battery. After, we unintentionally fry one while pulling this lever. It's in the next, very dark room that we come across the good old janitor once again. However, taking away the darkness allows us to see the janitor spawn in, which is still terrifying, but honestly, as long as we tiptoe, we'll be fine. Doing this following section is a tad easier with our nice, brightened view of course, but nothing is really going on out of bounds here. Eventually, we find our way into a room with exactly what we're looking for. Another battery. So, we make our way up, grab the battery, open the door, evade our long-armed friend, and then make a run for it before he catches on. The janitor will try to come after the kid, but clearly can't get through. Watching him retreat after his failed efforts will reveal that he just simply disappears eventually. We're now able to head up to the next area though, where a few more gnomes are in need of freedom. After retrieving these little fellas, I decided to go on another stroll with the camera, and that's when I came across the lady. She's just chilling in this elevator without her mask on. We won't encounter her in this elevator just yet though, as it's a little further into the game, but funnily enough though, we can find her mask down by our feet, which is sort of odd to see overall. After some good old teamwork, the gnomes and I make our way back to the furnace room, as my quest for gnomes continues. So we move across, then make our way up here, and come into this room where we need to jump on the floor until it breaks. Doing this follows with the janitor entering the room from a door in the back. Looking out of bounds shows that he appears once we break the floor, but that's when I spotted something really odd. The janitor's jacket appears to be hung up outside the level. I'm not entirely sure of the purpose for this, but here it is. While I was checking this out, I noticed a monkey that disappeared in my line of sight. That's when I realized that there are objects stored outside the room that correspond with what the janitor picks up and puts down. I even found a decapitated monkey toy way down below the map. In here though, we just need to evade the janitor once again and distract him by turning this on. We could then make our escape while he's distracted. So there's a body on the ground here that's full of rats, and they eventually scurry out. Getting a closer look at it shows that the rats are actually underneath the ground before appearing as if they came out of the body. Mind you, this part is actually normally pretty dark, making it hard to see this transpire to begin with. We can find a minecart out of bounds, which will end up swapping into the room as we lower the cart that's hanging in the middle of the room. Before doing that though, we need to free this little guy by jumping over and over until he hops off the shelf himself. I consider this gnome lucky, seeing as he comes out this fall without a scratch on him. Now we can make our way up here, lower the cart, and move on. Before doing so, we can check this room out with the all-seeing eye. Like security cameras, we're able to use this and observe other areas of the Maw, including areas that involve Six's adventure, which I thought was pretty cool when first playing through this. While checking this area out with the camera, I noticed a lever that is back behind the room we're currently in. Because I must know if it does something when pulling it, I decided to delete the wall, make my way back there, and pull away. Unfortunately, it does nothing. Well, to my knowledge, that is. So I leave disappointed, and I'm now tasked with retrieving a few more gnomes. As you can see, this is where we need to chase them through the coal, and I'll admit, sometimes they can be dodgy. We make quick work of these guys though, as I grab both of them, successfully getting out of this room, and then using teamwork to make the dream work. Eventually this leads back to the big furnace room, where we now have enough gnomes to get this machine running. We can see how this mechanism just generates from down below, but following it up shows how the level isn't fully loaded, as the bins are dumped and disappear. This is because of my player position, but most players will know that we take this ride up and eventually get off, as we don't want to get Toy Story 3'd. Pushing out from here, we begin to realize that there's a lot more gnomes on the ship than we initially thought, as we encounter even more. This leads into this little gnome family gathering. Between the visuals and music, I enjoyed this part. It made you really feel for all the characters in the game. Back behind this room though, we can find some random objects, along with some gnomes just floating about in this area. We can find a few more gnomes in a T-pose floating above the room we're in as well. Moving on eventually leads us to this elevator, which we had seen earlier before. Checking out the lady this time shows that she has her mask on, but we can see that there is still a mask at her feet as well, which I found curious. When the elevator began to move, I noticed that the lady's mask was no longer on her face, and it could be found down below still. Just how many masks does this lady have? The screen fades to black though, as we enter the final portion of the DLC. Starting off, we need to parkour out of this elevator shaft, but if we look within the elevator first, we'll see the lady is nowhere to be found. Taking a look at the entirety of this whole new section we're in shows that we're actually not too far from completing the DLC. However, shortly after getting out of the elevator shaft, we'll come across the lady with her back to us, as she listens to her music box. When I failed to sneak up on her, I had the game running at a slow speed, and as you can see, she proceeded to destroy me. However, if you remember from a previous chapter, if we're messing with the camera as our character dies, it will prevent the game from reloading us to our most recent checkpoint. In result, we'll see the kid fall to the ground as the lady continuously uses her power on her lifeless body. The lady has no remorse, and will do this until we restore our default camera. Anyways, there's a key here we must get once she's gone, so instead of waiting, I tried teleporting to it to see if I could snag it early. This resulted in death once again. So I decided to go full force this time, as I delete her from existence, climb this counter, and grab the key. Entering the next room, we can see we're not alone. These shadow children are going to be the main threat within this section. Progressing through this involves collecting 3 figurines that will end up needing to move forward. During the scavenger hunt is when we have our close encounters with these shadow children, and I gotta say, they are terrifying. Made out of a dark aura, the shadow kids are aggressive, childlike creatures created by the lady to guard her residence in the Maw. They hunger for one thing, our soul. So we must use our flashlight to keep them at bay. Holding the light on these fellows will eventually disintegrate them. There are 3 figurines that we need to collect, and we can actually see all 3 of them sitting out of bounds if we move out from this particular room. These ones floating out here probably function in a similar way to the other models we found earlier, if I had to guess, like the gnome swapping out and whatnot. Once we have all 3, we're able to move on. It's here where we once again run into the lady, checking herself out in a mirror. You can see in the reflection that she doesn't quite look the same, as she appears more homely and older. When we try to walk by her, she will see us, as she horrifyingly screams as the lights go out. Checking this out with this particular view mode shows that the reflection of her hasn't loaded in yet. But if we travel down below this area, we'll actually find the model that's used for the reflection in the mirror, which, I couldn't help but start laughing at as I got closer to it. This lady granny hybrid is quite the sight, if I'm gonna be honest. She'll just continue to touch her beautiful face with her gray soggy hands, basically mimicking the movement of the lady above, hence her reflection. This all works out though, as we wouldn't really be able to see that it's the granny's face in normal gameplay, so the developers could just safely reuse this. Rest in peace, Granny, I'll never forget you. It's at this point now that the lady begins pursuing us, so we make a run for it through this creepy dark room. From this view, it's not nearly as scary, but it allows us to see how she skates through objects during this scene, eventually disappearing. As this is happening, we can actually find the lady model that ends up getting us waiting in the upcoming room. So let's not keep her waiting, and evade these other ladies as we make our way to our inevitable demise. Most of you will know that the lady is about to come out of nowhere and turn this into the worst day ever for this kid. The screen will black out, only to reveal that she turned us into a gnome. Watching this unfold through this view is pretty painful to watch. During this, we can see the kid's arms, legs, and head begin to contort into his torso. Talk about a big nightmare. When the screen goes black, that's when the contorted kid is swapped with a gnome, along with the kid's clothes on the ground. The adventure from here takes an even sadder turn, as we realize we have lost our mobility overall. In an effort to escape, I teleported the gnome to the staircase, which in turn leads to a very predictable dead end. Deleting doors to avoid this awful fate that awaits us was also futile, as it leads nowhere. We do encounter a few guests throughout this part, but it's nothing we haven't seen before. They are still just as disgusting as our last encounter with them at 6. This of course follows with the end, as we quickly come to the realization that we are not just any gnome. We are actually the most unlucky gnome in the game. However, the game fades to black as the credits roll. Once the credits are finished, we see a TV in a random room, which basically teases the second Little Nightmares game that was in the works at the time. We can actually find this room by its lonesome down below the level. I ended up bringing the gnome kid in here for his own safety. In this version of the story, I decided that he gets to live and not become a certain someone's dinner. But there you have it. This concludes our out-of-bounds journey through Little Nightmares Secrets of the Maw and the whole Little Nightmares game. I hope you all enjoyed this game-breaking adventure. Subscribe if you did, and I'll see you in my next one. Cheers!